The sun was beginning to set over the city of Phoenix, casting long shadows over the tidy rows of homes in the suburban neighborhood where Carter and Karen lived. They were once a typical family. Carter, the doting father, Karen, the warm and loving mother, and Zoe, their bright and curious 10-year-old daughter who loved to paint, sing, and collect shiny stones she found in the schoolyard. Life had its ordinary rhythms: school drop-offs, homework sessions, and weekend adventures to the nearby canyons. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow. That promise was shattered one sunny afternoon. The Arizona sun was blistering that afternoon. Zoe Morgan was her usual bubbly self as she ran out of school, her dark curls bouncing with every step. Her pink backpack swayed behind her. She saw her mom, Karen, parked across the street. Karen waved, her smile tired but warm. "Zoe, over here." Zoe smiled back and ran toward her, her small legs pumping. She didn't notice the black SUV speeding down the road, the driver distracted by his phone. The moment happened too fast for Karen to process. "Zoe, stop!" Karen screamed, her voice sharp with panic. But it was too late. The sickening sound of the collision filled the air, followed by the sharp gasp of bystanders. Zoe's small body was thrown onto the pavement, her pink sneakers landing a few feet away. Karen's scream pierced the air as she ran to her daughter, dropping to her knees beside her. "Somebody call 911. Karen cried, her voice trembling. Zoe was rushed to Arizona General Hospital. Karen sat in the emergency room, her hands shaking as she waited for news. Her husband, Carter, arrived minutes later, his face pale and panicked. "She got hit," Karen said through her tears. "It was so fast, I couldn't stop it." Carter wrapped his arms around her, his heart pounding in his chest. "She's strong," he whispered. "She's gonna pull through." Hours passed before a doctor finally approached them. He introduced himself as Dr. Brad Wallace. "I'm very sorry," he said, his voice calm but distant. "We did everything we could, but Zoe's injuries were too severe." Karen collapsed into a chair, her sobs echoing in the quiet hallway. Carter stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. Within hours, Zoe's small body was prepared for burial. It was all a blur to Carter and Karen, picking out a casket, deciding on flowers, notifying family and friends. They chose a small, white coffin for Zoe. It felt too final, too real. Carter couldn't sleep the night before the funeral. He sat in Zoe's room, staring at her drawings taped to the walls, her favorite stuffed bunny still perched on her bed. He felt like he had failed her. He was her father. It was his job to protect her. That's when the idea came to him. It was strange, maybe even irrational, but he couldn't shake it. He would place a small camera inside Zoe's coffin. Not to be morbid, but to ensure she was at peace. It would help him feel like he was still watching over her. He wasn't ready to let Zoe go, not completely. The funeral day came and Carter installed the camera in secret, not even telling Karen. It was small and discreet, hidden in the lid of the casket. "I just need to know she's at peace," he whispered to himself as he secured it. An hour later, Zoe was laid to rest in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Phoenix. Friends and family gathered to say goodbye, their faces etched with sorrow. That night, Carter couldn't sleep. Karen had gone to bed early, but Carter stayed up, sitting alone in the darkened living room. He had almost convinced himself not to look. It felt too unhealthy, too painful. But curiosity won. He stared at the live feed from the camera on his laptop. The image showed the inside of the coffin, soft fabric lining the walls, and Zoe's still form wrapped in her favorite blanket. Her face was peaceful, and Carter felt a strange mix of comfort and sorrow as he watched. Hours passed. The screen remained still and quiet, just as it should be. Then, just after midnight, Carter heard it. A faint rustling sound. He froze, his eyes narrowing at the screen. The sound grew louder, like someone brushing against fabric. His pulse quickened. He turned up the volume, leaning closer to the laptop. And then it happened. The lid of the coffin began to lift. Carter stared at the screen, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The rustling sound grew louder. Slowly, the lid creaked open, and the camera's angle shifted, capturing the faint outline of the intruders. The first thing Carter saw was a gloved hand holding a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness inside the casket. The light swept over Zoe's face, and Carter felt a jolt of rage and fear. "Careful," a voice said, low and hurried. Another pair of hands appeared, gently lifting Zoe's small body from the coffin. The camera, still fixed to the lid, caught glimpses of the men's faces and outfit, blurred but unmistakably human. "Thank goodness she's still warm," one of them muttered. "We've got time." Carter's hands trembled as he watched. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could do was stare at the screen. The camera feed went dark as the casket lid closed, leaving Carter alone in the silent room with his racing thoughts. For a moment, Carter sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. His daughter, his little Zoe, had been taken, and the way the men handled her, the way they spoke, it didn't make sense. If she was dead, why would they be so careful? The words echoed in his head. "She's still warm. We got time." He replayed the footage, pausing to study the men's faces. He saw the flashlight, the way they moved with precision and purpose. This wasn't random. Without a second thought, Carter grabbed his phone and called Karen. "Karen," he said, his voice shaking, "you need to come downstairs. Now." Karen appeared moments later, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Together, they watched the footage. Karen's face shifted from confusion to horror as the footage played, her body trembling as she watched the men open Zoe's casket. When they lifted her out, Karen let out a choked sob and turned away. "They took her," Carter said, his voice tight with emotion. "She's not gone, Karen. They said she's still warm. She's alive." Karen shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, that's not possible. We buried her. We saw her." They called the police. When the police arrived, Carter showed them the footage, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. But the officers dismissed his claims, insisting the video had been doctored. "This isn't possible." One of them said, "People do crazy things when they're grieving. You've just lost your daughter. Maybe it's best to focus on grieving." Carter refused to give up. He turned to Karen's brother, Mike, a private investigator with a reputation for digging up the truth no matter how deeply it was buried. Together, they began to piece together a horrifying puzzle. Mike was a man who lived for challenges. He watched the video twice, pausing at every movement, every sound, and every shadow. When it ended, he looked up at Carter and Karen. "This isn't grief playing tricks," Mike said firmly. "Something's going on here, and we're going to find out what." The first lead came from a detail Carter hadn't noticed. The logo embroidered on the shirt of one of the men in the video. It belonged to Silver Horizon Funeral Home, the same place that had handled Zoe's burial. Mike wasted no time digging into the establishment's history. What he found was unsettling. Whispers of malpractice, complaints about rushed burials, and even a few cases of families claiming their loved ones' graves had been disturbed. None of it had ever led to charges, but the pattern was there. Meanwhile, Carter began to focus on Dr. Brad Wallace. With Mike's guidance, Carter requested Zoe's medical records from Arizona General Hospital. What he found sent a chill down his spine. The report stated that Zoe had been pronounced dead due to irreversible cardiac arrest. But buried in the details was a peculiar note. Zoe had been administered an injection shortly after arriving at the hospital. The name of the drug was unfamiliar to Carter, but Mike recognized it immediately. "This drug doesn't stop the heart permanently," Mike explained. "It slows it down, makes it almost undetectable for a while. If someone didn't know better, they'd think the person was dead." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Brad and the funeral home were working together, targeting children and teenagers who appear to have died in accidents. The drug gave them a window of time, just enough to stage a burial, exhume the body, and harvest the organs before the victim fully regained consciousness. Mike's contacts in law enforcement refused to take the case seriously, citing lack of hard evidence. But Mike wasn't discouraged. He suggested going undercover to get the proof they needed. The plan was simple but risky. Karen, wearing a disguise, posing as a grieving aunt, scheduled a visit to Silver Horizon to inquire about their services. Mike and Carter, wearing a disguise as well, equipped with hidden cameras, posed as her supportive family members. They were given a brief tour of the facility by the funeral home's director. He was polite, professional, and utterly unremarkable, until he began to speak about the importance of speedy arrangements. Families often find closure faster when the burial happens quickly, Leonard explained. We pride ourselves on efficiency. The moment he said it, Carter felt his stomach twist. He recognized director's voice from the camera footage. While Karen kept the director distracted with questions, Mike slipped into an off-limits area of the funeral home. What he found confirmed their worst fears. A cold storage room filled with rows of medical coolers, each labeled with organ types. There were no records, no paperwork, just the unmistakable smell of antiseptic and death. Mike captured everything on his hidden camera before sneaking back to the main office. He signaled to Carter and Karen that it was time to leave. That night, as they reviewed the footage, Mike made another chilling discovery. One of the coolers was labeled with Zoe's initials. She wasn't just another victim. They had plans for her. They're keeping her somewhere, Mike said, his voice tight with worry. They wouldn't harvest the organs there. It's too risky. They have to be working out of a private lab. Using the funeral home's financial records, acquired through a contact who specialized in digital forensics, Mike tracked a series of payments to a property on the outskirts of Phoenix. It was registered under a shell company linked to Dr. Brad Wallace. They had found the lab. Carter and Karen didn't wait for permission from the police. Armed with the footage, a crowbar, and sheer determination, they drove to the address in the dead of night. The building was a nondescript warehouse, surrounded by barbed wire and silence. They cut the lock on the gate and slipped inside. What they found was both horrifying and miraculous. Zoe was there, strapped to a medical table, her small body hooked up to monitors. She was unconscious but alive. Around her were trays of surgical instruments, charts detailing organ extraction schedules, and vials of the same drug that had nearly ended her life. Carter carried her up in his arms, tears streaming down his face. "We're getting you out of here," he said. The police arrived shortly after, called by Karen as she stood guard at the warehouse entrance. This time, with the physical evidence in hand, they couldn't deny the truth. Dr. Brad Wallace, the funeral director, and their accomplices were arrested, their illegal operation exposed to the world. Zoe was taken to a nearby hospital, where doctors confirmed she would make a full recovery. The trauma of the ordeal would take time to heal, but she was surrounded by love and support. Carter and Karen vowed to give her the life she deserved, no matter how long it took. As for Dr. Brad and the funeral director, they were sentenced to 15 years in state prison. Their operation had spanned nearly a decade, with countless lives stolen for profit. The scandal rocked Arizona to its core, prompting widespread reforms in both the medical and funeral industries.